Once upon a time, a long time ago, in a far and distant land, there lived a king and a queen who were very sad because they couldn't have a baby. And they were very worried because they needed an heir, they needed a son, they needed a prince. So they turned to the fairies for help. And sure enough, with the help of the fairies, the queen conceived. And 9 months later, she gave birth to a beautiful, bouncing baby boy. A prince was born. The heir to the throne had arrived. There was celebration throughout the land, and the fountains flowed with wine, and everybody feasted in the streets. But also living in that land was a wicked old wizard who kept pigs. One night, he secreted into the palace with a wee piglet, and he took the baby prince out of its crib and replaced it with a piglet. And when the king and the queen woke up in the morning, they were sorely distressed to see a piglet in the crib instead of their beautiful baby boy. And the queen was heartbroken, and she died of sorrow. But fortunately, the baby had a birthmark. And so the king sent his ministers and his people and his agents and his soldiers all out throughout the kingdom hunting for a baby with that birthmark. But none was found because the wily old wizard had put the baby boy onto the teat of the old sow. And the baby boy was in the pigsty, suckling for milk, and nobody knew he was there. So the baby grew up in the pigsty. As the years went by, the wicked old wizard dressed him in rags, not because he was bothered about clothing the boy, but because he didn't want anyone to see the birthmark. And so the little baby grew up amongst the pigs in the pigsty. And he knew only the wizard. The wizard was the only human being he spoke to, he communicated with, he learnt language. And the old wizard wasn't terribly wicked. He taught the little boy his letters, and he taught him to read, but he didn't let him communicate with any other human being for fear that he would be discovered. So the little boy knew nothing but the world of pigs and the wizard. But one day, the wizard was captured committing a terrible crime, and he was thrown into prison. And a few months before, the king had died, and civil war had broken out in the country as the barons were fighting for the throne, and people were weeping and wailing and bemoaning the fact that the prince had been lost. But when the wizard was in prison, the ministers of the realm sent in men-at-arms to search his premises, and they found hidden away in a drawer a little bundle of baby clothes, and on the baby clothes was the royal insignia. So they took the clothes back to the prison and they showed them to the wizard, and they said, "What are these baby clothes doing in your house, especially with the royal insignia on them?" And under pain of torture, the wizard confessed to his crime. And so he was immediately taken away and beheaded. Wicked old wizard. And they went to the pigsty, and they found the young man, because the little baby boy had grown into a strapping young man. But he had never had a bath, he had never had a shower, he was dressed in rags. You can imagine how he smelt. And they checked him over, and they found, sure enough, he had the birthmark. At long last, they had discovered the prince. So they said to the boy, young man, they said, "You're the prince. We need to carry you out of this place. We need to lift you out of this pigsty onto the litter and carry you to the palace." And the little boy, he had seen the palace walls, because the pigsty, the place where the wizard had kept the pigs, was right underneath the palace walls. All that time, the prince had been right under the nose of the king, and he didn't know it. But the boy had no idea what they were talking about. He'd never been inside a palace. He hadn't mixed with normal people. He was frightened. All he knew was the pigsty, and he wasn't sure he wanted to leave everything that was familiar behind. But they said, come with us, you have to trust. We're going to take you up into the palace. So eventually he let go of everything he knew. And he stepped into the void of the litter and allowed himself to be lifted out of the pigsty and into the litter. And they carried him through the gates of the city into the palace. And he was amazed at all the beautiful sights around him, all the colour, all the stalls, the bazaars, and all the wonderful way the people were dressed and the smells of the beautiful food. And they took him into the palace, and they washed him and they scrubbed him. And they dressed him in fine and beautiful clothes, and they put a crown upon his head. And they had a great celebration, and he ate food that he'd never tasted before, because he only got thrown old crusts by the wizard. He'd never tasted beautiful food and sweet meats and lovely wines. And they gave him a beautiful princess as a wife. And he came into the kingdom. The entire kingdom, thousands of square kilometers of land stretching as far as the eye could see, were all his now. But because the wicked old wizard had been executed, everything he owned was confiscated by the crown. And the pigsty and the pigs below the walls of the city belonged to the king. And the king could go back there any time he wanted. And you know, he did from time to time. He missed his humble origins. He would don the garb of a peasant. No one would notice. He'd slip out of the palace and go back with a few titbits for the pigs from the palace. And he'd throw the bits and pieces to the pigs and chat to the pigs, because he knew them so well, he remembered them. And the people loved this king because he was a humble king. He mixed with the people. He didn't have airs and graces. And he loved the people. He loved the ordinary people. And he had many children, and he lived happily ever after. And he made sure that the children went and spent time with the village people, with the animals, and working out in the fields where it was healthy in the sun, so that they could experience the humble life as well as the life of kings and princes. So the moral of this story is that if you allow yourself to be lifted through the door of light into eternity, if you can let go of all the things of this world that you treasure so, that you only know because you've never been to the higher realms of the universe. You don't know what a palace it is out there in the universe. You only know the pigsty that we know as the third dimensional earth, with all the mud and the grime and the toil. If you allow yourself to be lifted in the ascension, you don't lose anything. You don't lose this world. You don't lose your things. You gain everything. And everything you own in this world will still be yours. You can come back and visit this world anytime you want. You can be here. You can don the human form. You can have children and grandchildren. But you will not be limited to this world. You will have freedom of the universe. You will be a multidimensional being. And so, like the king who was a king but would take time out to visit the pigs and visit the village people, so you will be a king in your own right in the universe, but you will have the freedom to visit the humble, beautiful world that we know anytime you choose. So remember that with ascension, you don't lose anything. You gain everything.